I'd like to call my honor to call upon Rabbi Elchanan Shoff, a Rabbi here at Ewell Boys High School, also at Ewell Girls High School, to give Divrei Hesped for Rabbi Dovid Feinstien. Rabbi Shoff.
Thank you, Rabbi Schreiber. It's a humbling experience to have an opportunity to share words about Rabbi Dovid Feinstien. I suspect that the reason that I was asked to do so is because my wife is his great niece. My wife's grandmother, Rebbetzin Shifra Tendler, was the sister of Rabbi Dovid Feinstien. That's all. So we call him Uncle David. He's a great uncle. Just to give some background, being born in communist Russia, Reb Dovid was the third surviving child of Reb Moshe's 4 children. Reb Moshe Feinstein had a little boy named Pesach Chaim, who was his firstborn, who died at 3 years old. They took him to Minsk. He had whooping cough, and it was a big tragedy for the family. The next one was a daughter named Faya. The next one was a daughter named Shifra, who was my wife's grandmother. And the next was Reb Dovid Feinstein. Reb Dovid Feinstein was a young boy in communist Russia. They could not teach even Aleph Beis to the children. It was so frightening if it would be discovered that a child under 18 was taught religion. You could spend your life in Siberia for having taught them even how to read Hebrew. And therefore, it wasn't until they fled communist Russia on their way to the United States and stopped in Riga, where in the city of Riga, he found a Melamed and began to learn. He was 6 or 7 years old. It was a couple of years later that he would have otherwise started learning. And it was then that they discovered how incredibly precocious and brilliant he was. In fact, his Melamed had an accent, a real Litvish accent. Reb Dovid Feinstein would call Torah or Torah, he would call it Tere. He had more Litvish an accent, a more old world accent than even his father Reb Moshe did. And when you'd hear him at a wedding, you'd hear him saying, the brachas. Remember at my wedding, Keil Sasoin v'Keil Simcha, Keil Chasan v'Keil Kala. Reb Dovid really, picked up that accent. It was a remarkable thing, and it's something to remember. That's where he first was able to learn. At about maybe 7 years old. It's not 100% clear to me. They then came to America, and there were a few. Reb Moshe tried a yeshiva in Cleveland, which didn't work out. There was a couple of stops before they wound up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where Reb Moshe became the Rosh Yeshiva in the Siftei Tiferes Yerushalayim. Reb Dovid was there with his father. He must have gone to school. I'm not certain the exact place, but he never left. He never went to learn anywhere else. He didn't go to learn in Brooklyn. He didn't go to learn in Yerushalayim. He never left MTJ his entire life. That's an exaggeration. People leave places. They go somewhere for a wedding. They go somewhere on a vacation. But I asked within the family if anybody remembers him ever taking a vacation, just going away for vacation. And yes, before he was married, he took a cross-continental road trip to California. I mentioned that because that's where we are. He went to Los Angeles with 3 friends. They rented a car, and it was the only adventurous thing that anybody remembers him doing in his whole life. Other than that one story, essentially, he just stayed and learned Torah. He wasn't complicated. He didn't need to check out this Rosh Yeshiva, that place. He had his svarim. People remember him always learning without chavrusas. He would learn on his own in the office, or when he was younger in different places in yeshiva. He would learn with giant svarim. He always liked the big giant gemaras and the big things, and he would sit by himself and just learn Torah. There were times when he was older that he made some trips to Eretz Yisrael to visit grandchildren. I want to tell you a little bit more about his personality. David Feinstein basically did not speak in public. There was a handful of times where he gave a public drasha. Remember at the Chanukah Sabayis of the Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva, he spoke. He didn't speak at his mother's levaya, at his mother's funeral, but he did speak at her shloshim. He gave a real lecture. Other than that, at Reb Moshe Feinstein's levaya, his own father, the Gadol Hador, when the whole world was watching, he didn't speak. He didn't say anything. That's quite a remarkable thing. I mean, when I can contrast that to my thrill to be able to speak now to a small audience, because I have some family connection. What a privilege. I can get people to listen to me talking. Reb Dovid Feinstein had the whole world paying attention to him when his father, Reb Moshe, passed away. No. He didn't feel the need to speak. He didn't feel the need for any extra kavod. At the MTJ dinner, that was his yeshiva dinner every year, where everyone wanted to hear him speak, he would give a bracha at the very end for a minute or two. His bracha was always unique. He would always pick something from the tefillah, lilmod, ulalamed, lishmor, la'asos, ulakan. He would pick something that someone else wrote on Sheknesses HaGedolah, and he would share that and explain it. He didn't feel the need to say some brilliant creative thing. A person could have mistaken him sometimes for a simple person, for somebody who was just saying over a simple nice Devar Torah. He gave a Chumash shir on Fridays that was very popular, and a Mishnah Berurah shir on Sundays. There were times over the many, many years that he delivered these shiurim. Again, they were small. It wasn't like a public drasha, but these were shiurim. There were times when he had as many as 200 regulars, but usually it was a somewhat small shir. Spent some years as a 12th grade Rebbe in MTJ, and he would always be teaching small things, something similar to a Daf Yomi, not exactly Daf Yomi, Mishnayos for 5 minutes a shir. He never gave a high-level Pilpul Lumdis shir, despite the fact that he was quite capable, as we know from his Talmidim and from his, from what we have from him. He was a very family-oriented person. Dovid Feinstien was described by, I should mention that my father-in-law Shlita was very helpful for me in just preparing some of these remarks and finding out so many things. So he described him as such a good uncle. He was warm. He wasn't especially expressive, but he was warm and sweet. He was always generous. It was just last year that my wife's brother, which means that it's Reb Dovid's nephew's son, was getting married in Baltimore. And Reb Dovid had stopped really going to weddings. He was 9 years old or so. And the wedding was in Baltimore, where from New York, it was about a 4-hour drive each way. I personally we were shocked when Reb Dovid Feinstien, Shlita at the time, Zatzal, showed up at the wedding for 30 minutes and then turned around and drove back. He spent 8 hours in the car to show his love and support for his family. To show his nephew that he was there. It's something that I'll never forget. And he was so great. I want to contrast that to a story that I heard when I was living in Eretz Yisrael. Uncle Dovid came to visit his grandchildren, Fishelis and others, and I was talking to Rabbi Ginsburg, who was his gabbai. And Rabbi Ginsburg said that on that trip, just the day before, Rabbi Yashiv's, right-hand person had called Rabbi Ginsburg, asking if Reb Dovid would please come and visit Rabbi Yashiv. He'd like to speak with him. And Reb Dovid says, please tell him I'm not going to come. Thank you, but I'm not going to come. And Reb Ginsburg said, really? Why not? He said, one moment of Rabbi Yashiv learning Torah keeps the world going. He said, what do I have to talk to him about that's so important? He's trying to give me respect. He's trying to give me honor. I'm really fine. He said, please thank him so much and tell him that it's okay. I don't need to use up his time. He understood the preciousness of time of someone else and of his own, and he spent 8 hours driving to spend 20, 30 minutes at a wedding so that he could show how much he loves a family member and another Jew. Savta Shifra, Reb Moshe Tendler, Shlita's late wife, who was his older sister, would speak about him from the youngest of ages as if her brother was the Gadol Hador. She spoke of him, and she knew Godless because she was Reb Moshe's daughter. She knew what it meant to be a tremendously great person. He was always calm and patient. Uncle Dovid was always calm and patient. And you couldn't rile him up. If somebody would be bothering him on the phone or asking him questions, he had a very unique thing. He would just hang up the phone. If he felt he had answered your question, he wouldn't say, I'm sorry, I have to go. He just put it down. That was all. Nobody could get him upset. He never felt he had to explain himself to anyone. I once saw someone ask him, he had a certain opinion in halacha, and someone said, but Rav Moshe says differently. He said, yes, that was Rav Moshe's opinion, and it was a very great opinion, but I feel differently. He was not in the shadow of his father. Reb Dovid Feinstien consistently had different opinions of his father. After all, he was just like his father. His father, Rav Moshe, who was an original person, didn't necessarily agree with anyone else on every subject. Well, he didn't feel the need to either. And it's really, really hard, in my opinion, for someone whose father is the absolute Gadol Hador to not just become a clone, My father held this, my father held that. Reb Dovid was tremendously original, and he didn't, he was a very good father, they describe him. He never, ever raised his voice, much like his father of Moshe, who was just so, he was very friendly. He would give children Hanukkah geld and checks, and he wasn't super outgoing and warm and not super cold. He was reserved, but he was very friendly. He was very loving and kind. But the thing that stands out to me the most about Uncle Dovid, I have to say, I say this not just because it stood out to me, but it's what stood out to those around him, was his incredible humility. I want to show you a picture. I'm just going to share my screen for a moment. Does everyone see this picture of Dovid signing the cast of a little boy? It's not something you're going to see from a Gadol B'Yisrael in general. He just had no airs about him. As was mentioned, he never put on traditional rabbinic garb. He wore a suit and a hat. His tie was often a little bit askew. He was neat. But he just didn't take seriously what other people would, that didn't matter to him, looking for kavod. And I want to show you another thing, another picture. They asked here the question of the week, fun question of the week. If you could have 3 dinner guests, anyone from the beginning of time, Tanakh, history, music, sports, relatives, politicians, who would you invite? So you see here, Misha Elephant says, Meir Shapiro, the Divrei Chaim, the Brisker Rav. Yeah, Rabbi Y.Y. Rubenstein says, the Alshich, Rabbi Yerucham Lovavitch of Dessler, says Dovid Feinstien, I would find 3 anim. I'd find 3 poor people. That's all he had to say. He didn't have more to say than that. I'd find 3 poor people. He wasn't joking. He wasn't trying to avoid the question. I suspect he didn't fully understand the question that way. Who would you have? I mean, I'd find 3 poor people. I would do the biggest mitzvah I could. I have to spend time talking to Rabbi Yashiv. I mean, it's going to take up his time. If I had something to ask him, I would have called him. Every day, one of the students who was in MTJ remembers how every single day at recess, it was Manhattan. So there's no space. They didn't have a basketball. They had one wall, and they played handball against the wall. And every day, Reb Dovid played handball with Reb Nissen Alpert for the first 15 minutes of recess. So all the Talmidim would come out to want to use the yard, and they had to wait. He would take off his jacket and his tie and his, and his hat, and they would play a ferocious, that was the word that was used, a ferocious, aggressive game of handball, exercise. And it was so unusual for a gadol like this. And I just, he was obviously, we know also that he was very osek b'tzarchei tzibur. The one time that he would really step out and even fly around the country and fly around the world if necessary towards the end of his life was for helping. He was helping French Jewry, chinuch atzmai, is to make sure that the education in Israel for these people would be satisfactory. He felt a tremendous sense of achrayus. He felt a tremendous sense of responsibility. If there was something he could do to help others, he realized that he had to do so. So his humility did not preclude him from understanding his own tremendous capacity for making change. If there was a meeting of some kind, I mean, he would stop whatever it was. It didn't make a difference how personal and how important. A meeting on behalf of Klal Yisrael is more important than anything else. And he wouldn't come a second late, and he would devote all of his attention to it. You wouldn't see him fiddling or eating something or doing anything else. This was something that, what's really, really interesting is that he never had any projects of his own, as far as I know. He always fully threw himself into support something. He never needed it to be the Reb Dovid Feinstien. If he would have started a project, people were throwing money at him. People were prepared to support him and help him on whatever he needed. Someone described to me once showing up to the yeshiva, and he had an appointment with Reb Dovid Feinstien, but he'd never met him, so he didn't know what he looked like. And so he was sitting there, and he's noticing this old man stocking the soda machine and the candy machine, wearing a sweater. And he says hello to the person. And then at like 10 minutes later, when it's time for his appointment, he gets called into the office, and he can't believe that was Reb Dovid, who was stocking the soda machine himself. And it's just something a Rosh Hashiva would never do. His humility was legendary. And I think that's amazing how that extended to, it never had to be him. He was never about the spotlight. To not speak at his father Reb Moshe's funeral. I mean, art school was having a hard time early on, and he gave his life savings. He gave $200,000. But here's more. Art school. I mean, it would have closed down, it seems. Everything we have from art school, all the Gemaras, all the learning, all the Daf Yomi. But his own family, to this day, has no idea where the money came from. They don't know where he made the money from, how he got the money. Did he inherit it? Like, nobody knows. His own wife doesn't know. And you know why? Because no one would question him. He was larger than life with his family, with his students. He just didn't allow argument. He wasn't high-handed. He would just put the phone down. You couldn't start asking him, where'd you get the money? What does it mean? He couldn't be pressured. He couldn't be nudged. He had a tremendous strength of his convictions, but he was totally humble. You didn't have to agree with him. He would just shake his head and go back to his learning. If you disagreed with him, you disagreed with him. I just want to finish by saying this. I think we can learn something tremendous from Uncle Dovid, all of us. And since I'm speaking specifically to my dear friends in high school, so many people make choices in life based on kavod. People that are boreach achar kavod. People will choose a profession that's not what's really good for them, but it looks prestigious. It looks prestigious to them to perhaps become an attorney, but they don't really want to be an attorney, but they don't listen to that voice because the kavod is important to them. And then for many years of their life, they suffer at a job that they didn't like. You'll have people that choose whom to marry based on what other people will think. Running after kavod is a tremendous, tremendous desire. But when you run after kavod, it can be very destructive. Kavod is motzi'in es ha'adam min ha'olam. Kavod can take you away. Wanting the respect and admiration of others, I believe it's something we can't break. It's something we really want. But when that guides our decisions, it's very dangerous. So Chazal tell us something amazing. They say if you run away from kavod, the kavod will run after you. You'll actually get the kavod. In other words, tremendously desiring honor, they realized you can't break that. But we can tantalize you with more kavod to give up the kavod now. David Feinstien is a person who is so respected precisely because he didn't demand or ask for any respect. He didn't put himself in the spotlight, and yet from all over the world, the most important questions, the most important ideas came his way. I mean, we have the privilege to live lives of dignity and commitment and loyalty without looking to run around, just serving Hashem in the way that we are supposed to. And maybe learn from the great tzaddik, David Feinstien, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, what it means to be a loyal servant of Hashem, to be comfortable in our own skin, to not have to run after the opinions or attitudes of other people, but instead to sit down and to learn Torah and to apply that Torah and to do just what's right. I ask Mechila from all those within the family, and for surely not having done even a little bit of justice, to the memory of David Zatzal. But Tehei Nishmaso Tzura B'Tzura HaChaim. Thank you all for listening.